There's a cabin standing at 50 below zero tonight. Walls just 6 inches of solid pine, and the man asleep inside it is warm. I built that cabin with my own 2 hands. 3 summers, log by log. 40 miles from the nearest paved road, and I'll tell you straight, before I tell you anything else, it isn't the logs keeping him warm. Not on their own. There's a rule the old hands lived by, and it's got almost nothing to do with how thick a man cuts his logs. Stay with me, because once you hear that rule, you'll understand why the folks selling insulation today would rather you never learned it. My name's Cole Hartwell, and I've lived in the mountains of northwest Montana for better than 50 years, trapping, guiding, and wintering alone in country where one bad decision costs a man everything. That cabin I just told you about is mine, and I've slept through 50 below nights inside it more times than I can count. I'm not guessing at any of this. I paid for it. By the time this video's done, you'll know the one rule that actually explains why an old cabin holds its heat, and you'll stop giving the credit to the wrong thing entirely. I want to say something else too, and I want you to sit with it a minute. The insulation companies and the energy folks who sell you on keeping a house warm have known about this rule for years, and there's a reason they've never once brought it up. Most people get the story backward on this one. A 6-inch log wall, the exact kind those old cabins were built from, has what a builder calls a clear wall R-value of right around 8, maybe 8.5, while a modern stud wall packed with fiberglass bats, built to that same 6 inches, comes in closer to 14. That's not folklore. That's the same math the University of Alaska's own Cooperative Extension Service has published for years, comparing log walls straight against framed ones. In plain terms, a modern insulated wall resists heat almost twice as well as a wall of solid pine. Log for log. If the logs themselves were the answer, those old cabins should have run colder than a modern house, not warmer. There's a reason they didn't, and it comes down to how heat actually leaves a room. Heat moves out of a cabin 3 ways. It moves straight through the wood itself, slow and steady. It rides out on the air, slipping through every crack and gap a log leaves when it bows or twists, and it radiates straight off a cold surface into the night. Of those 3, the air moving through gaps is by far the worst offender, and it's the one static numbers like R-value never account for. A cabin can have thick walls and still feel like standing in the open, because the warm air inside keeps getting traded for cold air pouring through the seams. Thick wood and stone do one thing well, and it's holding on to heat, not blocking it. Mass like that soaks up warmth while a fire's burning and gives it back slow once the fire dies down. The same way a cast iron skillet stays hot long after you've pulled it off the coals. The Department of Energy looked at log walls for years and judged them only by that plain R-value number. And by that measure, log walls came up short every time. Later on, they revised that thinking, because a wall with real mass behind it can perform every bit as well as a higher-rated wall, provided the air isn't leaking straight through it. That's the whole hinge the old cabin swung on. Trap the heat, and the mass carries it through the night. Fail to trap it, and that same mass does you no good at all. My grandfather Amos never once heard the term R-value in his life, and he didn't need to. Pete DeMont, the old trapper who took my learning further when Amos had done with his teaching, French-Canadian on one side with fur trade blood going back generations, gruff and exact, taught me the same lesson a different way, with his hands in the mud instead of a chart on a wall. I'll show you exactly what he showed me in a few minutes. Amos and Pete didn't call it chinking and daubing back when they taught it to me. They just called it doing the job right. The method is simple enough to say in one breath. Pack every gap between the logs so tight that wind and cold can't find a way through, and let the wood and stone do the rest. It costs next to nothing, mostly clay, sand, ash, dried grass, and a strong back. The same materials sitting on most any piece of land. A man willing to work can see the difference inside a single season. Walls that used to whistle in a wind going dead quiet. I'll be straight with you about the one honest limitation before we go any further. Mud chinking cracks as the logs dry and shrink, and it needs redoing every few years. So this was never a job a man did once and forgot. The old hands worked this the exact same way every time, plain, with the why under every step, so you understand the rule instead of just memorizing it. The first thing you have to accept is that logs never meet each other perfectly. They bow, they twist, and they shrink as they season, and every one of those movements opens a gap that wind pours straight through. That's why the old method never relied on the logs alone. It used two layers working together. An inner layer called daubing packed deep into the gap, and an outer layer called chinking pressed in over the top to finish and protect it. Neither layer does much on its own. Together they seal a wall the logs never could by themselves. A word of caution on those terms, because you'll hear them used both ways, depending who's talking. Old craftsmen used chinking to mean the material stuffed in behind the visible mud, and daubing for the outer coat you can actually see and touch. Plenty of folks today use the words backward from that, calling the visible outer coat the chinking. It doesn't much matter which word you use, so long as you understand both layers have to go in. The hidden blocking and the visible seal over top of it. The wall doesn't care what you call the mud, it only cares whether the gap is full. The mix itself is nothing exotic. The old recipe runs about 1 part clay to 2 or 3 parts sand, worked with just enough water to make a mud that holds together without running. Into every bucket of that mud goes a good double handful of fibre, straw, dried grass, or hair pulled from a horse or a cow, whatever a man had on hand. The sand keeps the clay from shrinking and cracking hard as it dries, and the fibre holds the whole mix together, much like rebar holds concrete, so the dried daub doesn't crumble out of the gap the first time the logs shift. For the widest gaps, the old hands didn't fill the whole space with mud alone. They wedged in something rigid first, a scrap of wood, a flat stone, even a corn cob. Anything that filled the bulk of the space and gave the softer mud something solid to grip and pack against. Skip that step on a wide gap, and you're asking soft mud to span a hole it was never meant to bridge alone. And it will fall right back out the first time the logs move. Getting the mix right matters less than getting the packing right. A man works the mud in from both the inside and the outside of the wall, pressing it deep so it fills the gap completely instead of just skinning over the front of it. He angles the outer face so rain sheds away from the wall instead of running behind it and rotting the log underneath. This isn't a one-pass job. Expect to spend several days on it, and expect to come back a second time once the first layer dries and shrinks, because it will crack, and every crack is a door for the cold. It's easy to think all that mud is just cosmetic, but it isn't. One owner of a chinked log home put it about as plain as it gets. Done right, the place isn't drafty, and once it's up to temperature, it holds that warmth a long time. That's the whole rule in one sentence. The mud isn't insulation the way a modern bat of fiberglass is insulation. Its entire job is stopping the air from moving. And once the air stops moving, the mass of the logs finally gets a chance to do its work. I'll tell you plain, the first time I chinked my own place, I got the mud too wet and spent half a cold afternoon watching my own work slide right back out of the gap onto my boots. Pete never did let me live that one down. A little patience with the mix saves you the whole afternoon I lost. Some men figured they could skip the mud work entirely and just build with the thickest logs they could find instead, betting that raw mass alone would carry them through. That thinking misses the whole point. Extra thickness slows down the steady kind of heat loss, the kind moving straight through solid wood. But it does nothing at all against a draft pouring through an open seam between two logs. A man who studied chink joints for a log-building trade group found that the chinking material itself adds almost no real insulating value to a wall. Joint or no joint. What it does instead, and what it does better than almost anything else in the whole cabin, is stop outside air from getting in. That single job, stopping the air, matters more to how warm a cabin feels than any amount of added log thickness ever could. Old accounts of trappers building these cabins describe the same pattern over and over. Once the walls and roof were up, a man spent several days working clay and grass into every crack, then came back after the first hard freeze to patch whatever had opened up again. Those accounts aren't laboratory measurements, and I want to be straight with you about that. But the direction they point isn't in question. A wall full of open seams feels almost as cold inside as the air outside it, and a wall packed tight against every one of those seams turns into a different building entirely. Now, the honest warning. And I want this said before you get too excited about how simple this sounds. Mud chinking cracks. It cracks every single year as the logs keep shrinking and the seasons turn the mud through wet and dry and freeze and thaw. Skip the yearly check and every one of those cracks turns back into the exact gap you sealed in the first place. The old hands walked their own walls every fall before the snow came, patching what had opened up. Because a rule you stop tending is a rule you've already broken. Boring is what surviving actually looks like. Sealing the walls was only half of the rule. There's still the matter of how big a man builds the place to begin with. Because a tight-sealed cabin the size of a barn asks more of one small fire than any amount of mud can make up for. I'll get to that part shortly, but I wanted the ceiling laid out first. Because it's the piece nearly everyone gets wrong, and it's the piece that does the most work. Almost nobody talks about mud, clay, and small windows the way I just did. And there's a reason for that. I want to be careful and fair about it, though, because I'm not claiming there was ever a meeting where anybody decided to keep this from you. Modern home heating in this country runs on a handful of recurring products: spray foam, batting rated by the inch, contractor-installed retrofits, and a whole industry built around chasing a higher R-value number on the package. Every one of those products shares one trait: mud never had. A man buys them once, and if the house is still cold, the answer the industry gives him is to buy more insulation, hire another crew, or upgrade to a higher-rated product next time around. There's a simple reason the cheap fix gets left out of that conversation. A bucket of clay and sand a man mixes himself on ground he already owns with grass and hair he already has generates exactly one sale. NONN. Nobody restocks mud. Nobody schedules a mud contractor to come back next spring. The whole trade around insulation is built on repeat business. And a fix a man can do himself for free forever doesn't fit anywhere into that model. I'm not telling you modern insulation is worthless, because it isn't, and I'd be lying to you if I said otherwise. What I am telling you is that the entire way it gets sold, by the R-value number stamped on the package, leaves out the two things that mattered most to every mountain man who ever stayed warm through a hard winter. It leaves out whether the air is sealed, and whether the walls have the mass to hold heat once you've trapped it. Neither one shows up on a package label, so neither one gets sold, and neither one gets taught. The Department of Energy figured this out the hard way. The same folks I mentioned earlier who judged log walls only by that flat R-value number for years before admitting the mass mattered. If the government's own energy office needed years to catch up to what a mountain man's cabin already proved every winter, you can guess how long it takes an industry selling insulation by the roll to bring it up on its own. The mud was never the whole rule, and I promised you the rest of it. The old hands backed that ceiling up with 3 more habits, and together they turn one trick into a complete system. The first is tight notching. The less gap a man leaves between his logs to begin with, the less mud he ever has to pack in, and the less there is left to leak. The first builders in a stretch of country cherry-picked the straightest old-growth logs they could find, ones that already sat close and square against each other with barely any hewing at all. A careful notch at every corner locked those logs down tight and kept the gap between them to almost nothing before a single bucket of mud ever went on. But tight notching alone doesn't finish the job either, because a corner can fit perfect and a whole cabin can still run cold if the building itself is too big for one fire to fill. That's where the second habit comes in, building small and low, and this one started as a labor problem before it ever became a physics lesson. A man building alone could only lift a log about as high as his own shoulders and head would allow, which put most one-man cabins at just 6 or 7 feet tall, 6 to 8 logs stacked total. Each wall ran somewhere around 12 to 16 feet, making the whole cabin roughly a single small room. A man never chose those dimensions to save on heating. He chose them because that's as high as he could lift alone. But a small room asks far less of one fire than a big one does. Less air to warm in the first place, and less wall surface for that warmth to escape through. That labor limit turned out to be the very thing that made the mass and seal rule work as well as it did. Small and low took care of the volume. It didn't take care of the heat source itself, or the handful of openings every cabin still needed. So the third habit was the fireplace and the openings around it. A stone fireplace went up at one end of the cabin, doing double duty, cooking a meal and adding still more mass to hold the day's heat overnight. Openings stayed few and small on purpose, usually just 1 or 2 windows that rarely saw a pane of glass in their life, covered instead with a greased hide, a sheet of greased paper, or a plain wood shutter. Every opening in a wall is one more place the seal has to work around, so the old hands kept the count as low as they could stand. Even a tight, small cabin with a good fireplace still had one weak point sitting right at ground level. So there's a fourth habit, and it's one I still do myself every fall, before the first real snow sets in. I warp the base of my own cabin and bank earth and packed snow right up against the sill, the same trick trappers used on their line cabins 100 years back. It closes off the draftiest, lowest gap in the whole structure and layers in one more course of insulation for free, right where the cold ground meets the warm wall. It won't replace a poor seal higher up the wall, but it finishes the job at the one spot a man's most likely to forget. None of those 4 habits work alone, and I want to be honest about the weak points too. A greased hide over a window is a compromise, letting in a little light while still losing more warmth than a sealed wall ever would, which is exactly why the old hands kept windows to a bare minimum instead of pretending glass wasn't missed. Put the 4 together with the chinking, tight notches, a small footprint, a fireplace doing double duty, and a bank of earth at the base, and you've got the complete rule, not just the one piece everybody remembers. Step back from one cabin for a second, because this rule is bigger than logs and mud. What the old hands understood was a piece of knowledge that cost a man nothing but labor and attention, learned the hard way by people who didn't have a second chance if they got it wrong. Most folks alive today have never once been taught to think about their own shelter that way. They've been taught to trust a number on a package instead, and to call a contractor the moment something feels cold, rather than understand why it went cold in the first place. That matters beyond just staying warm. A man who understands the difference between mass and insulation, between a sealed wall and a thick one, isn't at the mercy of whoever's selling him a fix. He can look at his own cabin, his own shed, even his own house, and know exactly where the problem actually lives instead of guessing. The more you know, the less you carry. The men who taught me this, Amos and Pete both, are gone now, and knowledge like theirs is going the same way with most of their generation. I'd rather hand it to you plain than let it disappear. I won't pretend that knowledge alone keeps every house warm, because plenty else goes into it. But the piece that's within your control, the ceiling, the size, the mass, That part is entirely yours to get right, no matter what anybody's selling you this winter. This whole rule compresses down into what you can actually do this weekend, whether you're working on a cabin, a shed, or just thinking harder about your own house. First, mix a small test batch of daub, about 1 part clay to 2 or 3 parts sand, water enough to hold together, and a good double handful of straw or dried grass worked through it. Test it on 1 scrap gap before you commit to the whole wall. Second, once you trust the mix, work it into every visible gap from both faces, angled so water sheds away, and plan on a second pass once the first layer dries and cracks, because it will. Third, walk your corners and check how tight your notches actually sit, tightening or shimming anything that's opened up wider than it should be. Fourth, before the ground freezes, bank earth, leaves or packed snow against the base of every exterior wall, closing off the sill the same way the old trappers did on their line cabins. Fifth, mark your calendar for next fall and next spring, and walk the whole wall both times, patching any crack before it turns back into the gap you already fixed once. Total cost on most of this run's just a few dollars if you've got clay, sand and straw within reach, mainly the price of your own time and a sore back for a weekend or two. Do it right, and by the time the first hard freeze hits, you'll feel the difference in how long your own fire actually holds. If you want more of the old way explained plain instead of sold to you, subscribe and stick around. Tell me where you're writing in from and how hard your winters actually run, because I want to hear it. If you've ever chinked a wall, banked snow against your own place, or tried any piece of this yourself, tell me exactly what happened, good or bad. Every story like that teaches the rest of us something worth knowing. There's another cabin I think about often, one where the walls held, the fire never went out, and the man inside still didn't wake up come morning. It wasn't the cold that got him, and it wasn't the wind either. It was the ground he slept on, the one thing that pulled the heat clean out of him faster and quieter than any storm outside ever could. I'll show you exactly what that ground was doing to him, and the one old trick that would have stopped it cold. Build it tight, build it small, and keep the fire steady. Let the mass do the rest.